Welcome back, Endgame viewers. We're here today to talk about our must-have wide receivers. Already broke down our running backs that we're targeting in all drafts. Now it's wide receiver time. So Chris, let's start off. Who is one of those early round wide receivers that you always will have your eyes on?
Yeah, it's Stefon Diggs, and I know it's easy to say, well, of course, Stefon Diggs, but here's the thing. A lot of times, Tyreek Hill goes over him, Devontae Adams goes over him, sometimes other guys will go over him, and I don't understand it because this is a guy who led the league in not only in receptions last year, but in yards, but he only had 8 touchdowns, right? And to put that in perspective, Devontae Adams, who had less catches and less yards, had 18. So you got to think those touchdown numbers are going to go up. Last year was his first year with Josh Allen, so no reason to think he can't be just as good in terms of the receptions and the yards. And this is a guy who I'm sure none of you, maybe a few of you follow this guy, but there's a guy who really looks into wide receivers and looks into their success rate on different routes. And Stefon Diggs is a beast on every single route. He can run every single route. He can get open on every single route. And guys who are always open get the football. That's why he led the league in receptions and yards last year. No reason to think he can't do it again. And like I said, if he gets into double-digit touchdowns, he may end up as the number 1 fantasy wide receiver this year. So he's a guy, I love his situation. I love his situation out there in Buffalo with Josh Allen. It's a high-volume passing attack. He's their clear number 1. He's a guy I try to get every time I can.
Yeah, interesting that the receiver who led the league in yards, like you said, is not number 1 fantasy receiver being drafted. But yeah, he's a craftsman. He's a guy, he's not the biggest, right? Not the fastest necessarily. He's not a DK Metcalf or Julio Jones, one of these guys that just looks like your prototypical receiver build. He's just a good receiver, right? And tied to a good quarterback. And that reminds me of a young player called CeeDee Lamb, who again, not the biggest receiver there, maybe not going to run a 4.3, outrun Tyreek Hill, but he's a really good receiver, really good hands. He knows how to run crisp routes, and he's tied to Dak Prescott, who he only got to play 5 games with last year as a rookie. So considering the fact that he still put over 900 yards up with a combination of, Andy Dalton, Garrett Gilbert, Ben DiNucci, and he still had a pretty good rookie season. If we get a full year of Dak, fingers crossed, I think that CeeDee Lamb will definitely outperform his ADP, and a lot of times he's being drafted 3rd, 4th round. This is a guy who absolutely could be a top 10 receiver, so I'm eyeing CeeDee Lamb every chance I get. All right, now on to you. Who's your next must-have receiver?
Well, speaking of Dallas, I'm going to say Amari Cooper. And to me, I love CeeDee Lamb. I love that pick. I think CeeDee Lamb's going to have a monster year, but I think Amari Cooper is going to have a monster year too. I don't think there's going to be a big separation between these two guys at the end of the season. And what's happening right now is Amari Cooper's on PUP. All these videos and highlights of CeeDee Lamb are coming out of training camp, and his ADP is skyrocketing. This guy is now, going over guys. I've seen him be drafted ahead of Allen Robinson and Terry McLaurin. Now, this guy's going to jump into the top 10 pretty soon. Meanwhile, Amari Cooper's falling. Why? Because this guy's on PUP? Doesn't matter. He can be activated from PUP at any time. The injury isn't serious. There's nothing to think that he's not going to be ready for week 1. He doesn't need training camp, right? It's hard to believe that Amari Cooper's only 27 years old because it feels like he's been in the league for 10 years. But this guy does not need training camp. He can show up week 1 and be fine. And like you said, with Dak Prescott, with a healthy Dak Prescott, this offense is a fantasy goldmine. Love CeeDee Lamb, but I also love Amari Cooper, and the fact that he's falling in drafts means I have to grab this guy every time.
Yeah, you can look at it both ways. Depends how worried you are about the injury in the preseason. Again, it's still early, but you can say, well, that's a reason to kind of prefer Lamb over Cooper. But if the value gets out of hand, and Lamb starts going a lot sooner, Cooper does become the better pick. So it just all depends how your draft plays out. And you know what? It doesn't have to be you pick one or the other. I mean, realistically, you're only probably going to get the chance to draft one of those guys. You pick the guy who you think is the better value at the spot that you have. All right, now I think Chris Godwin is a great value because, you know what? Last year, the hype got maybe a little out of hand. He was being drafted, as a top 10 receiver. In Dynasty, he was all the way up to a top 5 receiver. And it's not that he just kind of busted or, didn't connect with Tom Brady. He was hurt. Like, he legitimately had a hurt pinky that he needed surgery on and then played a game with a splint. it kind of makes it hard to catch when you have something on your hands. So despite the fact that he also missing a game with COVID, only played, I think it's 12 games, in a point per game average in terms of fantasy points, he was a top 15 receiver. And now, because last year was kind of disappointing based on where he was drafted, he's kind of fallen down out of that range. And I think that this is a guy who now is going to exceed expectations because we lowered the bar for him. Look, there's room for more than one receiver there. Mike Evans still had a good season. Antonio Brown is there. I'm not too worried about that cutting into his production because you know what? There's 3 receivers that could all feed from Tom Brady. Absolutely. And Godwin, I think, is being a little undervalued at this point. I'm perfectly fine with him as a wide receiver too. Every time I will take him. Or what do you think, Chris? Do you think there's room for more than one fantasy viable receiver in Tampa?
Yeah, I promise I didn't do this on purpose. I just realized now I'm picking Antonio Brown right after you pick Chris Godwin, but I promise it was not intentional. But I do really like, again, I love the value of Antonio Brown because I love Mike Evans. I love Chris Godwin. But you know what? Those guys are going round 3, round 4, round 5. You can wait, 3, 4, 5 rounds and get Antonio Brown. This guy down the stretch was really starting to come on. You got to remember, he went a year and a half without any football. Didn't even join the team until week 8. It took him a while to get going, but look at the last 3 regular season games. He averaged over 23 fantasy points per game. Now, I'm not saying he's going to do that for a full season. I don't expect him to do that, but you don't need him to because, again, this is a guy you're drafting in the 8th, 9th, 10th round of your fantasy drafts, but he has legitimate wide receiver 2 potential. We're talking about a guy who over the span of the 6 years probably had the greatest 6-year stretch in the history of the NFL as far as wide receivers go. He is an elite wide receiver. Even to this day, he's still a very good wide receiver. Great footwork, great hands, great route running. And I got to think, with this connection with Tom Brady now going into the second season, we're going to see more of Antonio Brown this year. So yes, I do think there's room for all 3 of these guys. And to me, Antonio Brown at his value is an absolute steal because, again, I think this is a guy who can give you weekly wide receiver 2 numbers, and you're getting them, as a wide receiver 5, maybe even a wide receiver 6, depending on how your draft goes.
Yeah, a lot of people want no part of him because, well, a lot of the off-field issues, really, and he seems to have cleaned it up. We didn't really hear much about him last year. Maybe he's a model citizen now, who knows? But everything seems good, and you know what? That's a Bruce Arians offense. They're going to pass it a lot, all the time. It doesn't matter, what the game script is. So definitely room for all 3 of those receivers to be fantasy viable every single week. And I think the same could be said for the Chargers offense if everything, falls into place and people actually stay healthy. So I'm looking at Mike Williams because Keenan Allen is an obvious pick in the early rounds as your number 1 receiver. Mike Williams is now starting to fade from people's memories just because last year was kind of disappointing. But again, he wasn't 100%. He didn't miss a ton of games, but he wasn't 100% when he was out there all the time. And I know people are worried about the connection. Maybe Justin Herbert and him just don't jive. I'm not worried about that. It's a good quarterback with a talented receiver. I think they'll figure it out. And Mike Williams did still put up some nice games. This is a guy who averaged over 15 yards per reception. For his career, he averages 16.7 yards per reception. He is a big playmaker. He is a big body and a red zone threat. This is somebody that with a full season together with a really good young quarterback could easily get back to the 1,000-yard mark like he did 2 years ago. And let's remember, this is a new coaching staff too. This whole team, just in general, should be much better. And I think that Williams now, as the clear number 2 guy, with a lot of question marks really as far as the 3rd receiver, 4th receiver, and so on, I think he's going to get back to a high level of play. And he's being drafted, kind of the same range as Antonio Brown. You can get him as your 4th, maybe even 5th fantasy receiver, depending on your league size. And he could absolutely smash that ADP. All right, those are our must-have receivers. What do you think? Agree, disagree? Let us know in the comments. Let's start some dialogue. Hit us up and let us know what you think. Thanks for watching, guys.